I'm Trudy Coxe. I'm the CEO and Executive Director of the Preservation Society. And today we are inside the Newport mansions with our guest and biographer, TJ Stiles.
Hello.
TJ is an impressive man. He received the 2010 Pulitzer Prize for biography and the 2009 National Book Award for nonfiction for The First Tycoon, The Epic Life of Cornelius Vanderbilt. And in fact, TJ came to Newport to discuss that book several years ago. He won the 2016 Pulitzer Prize for History for Custer's Trials, A Life on the Frontier of New America. He is an author of the award-winning Jesse James' Last Rebel of the Civil War, and he is currently writing a biography of Teddy Roosevelt. We're very lucky because on Wednesday, May 18th at 6 p.m., TJ will present a lecture entitled Age of the Machine, the Fight to Reinvent Democracy in the Gilded Age. And it is going to take place in the Great Hall of the Rakers. I think a perfect setting. It is live and via Zoom, and it is part of our ongoing lecture series entitled The Gilded Age Years, Transforming America. And what we've tried to do with this Gilded Age Years series is to introduce people to everything they could ever want to know about the Gilded Age. TJ, of course, is going to be talking about politics. You can learn more or purchase a ticket by visiting newportmansions.org. So we have so many questions to ask you, TJ. And one of the questions that we have asked all of our lecturers thus far, and believe me, the answers have been very different, is how do you define the Gilded Age? And when did it begin? And when did it end?
It started in March of 1883 and ended in April of 1883 as well. Now, of course, it's very hard to answer that question because of two things. One is the very name, the Gilded Age, is controversial. And for example, one of the greatest historians, economic and business historians, and historians in general, Richard R. John at Columbia University, really dislikes the name entirely and is trying to find alternatives. But once something is set, it's hard to get rid of. The problem with the name Gilded Age is that, like any name, it sets out an agenda. What are you interested in? And then you name the era based on what you're interested in. And defining the timeline is difficult as well. So for example, Gilded Age, taken from a book that predates when most people start the Gilded Age, the novel by Mark Twain and his partner, has nothing to do with any of the things most people associate with the Gilded Age, except for perhaps political corruption. It has nothing to do with business or big business, lifestyles of the rich and famous, et cetera. And that's what we think of. To gild, of course, as your other guests have said, it means it's not golden, it's just a sheen, it's a cover over a corrupt or at least less attractive interior. And, so I'm not going to argue over what it should be called right now. Let's focus on the dates. But, just remembering that, is business or is corruption the only thing we're interested in? What are all the things that are going on in the same era? There is the end of the wars with Native Americans, the stripping of their sovereignty and of their cultural autonomy, and the remaking of the West. There is the integration of the West into the mainstream economy. There is also the role of the US in the world, which begins to go through a dramatic change at this time. There's also, of course, the rise of industry and of the working class and organized working class with labor unions and major strikes. And then there's the South, where most African Americans lived still, and where they were still struggling to maintain their political presence, still into the 1880s and even 1890s, electing members of Congress, taking part in state politics in some places, even though the federal government, the central enforcement of civil rights laws had been retracted in 1877. So there's a lot going on. If I had to give it a name, I'd probably give it the name, the age of consolidation, when there's a federal consolidation coming along, when there's a political consolidation in the South and in the North, But there's so many things going on. It's hard to pick one name. So let's stick with Gilded Age. I would guess.
But you would admit that it's sometime recently after the Civil War ish, or
Yeah.
maybe mid 1870s, or
Yeah, I would say it's probably, if you are, some people would say from 1865 all the way to 1920. And Heather Cox Richardson has suggested that. And that it should be called the Age of Citizenship, because it's in this era when corporations get a form of citizenship from the 14th Amendment and the later interpretations of that. Then the question of Native citizenship and the question of Black citizenship, which is going up and down in the degree in which it's enforced. So yeah, so it's tough. I tend to think it's important to keep Reconstruction as its own period, even though it overlaps with a lot of what we're talking about with the Gilded Age. So sometime in the 1870s, probably to 1880, there's a period when federal enforcement of Reconstruction ends, and it's carried forward on the ground by Black citizens. And then you've got a period when there's clearly been a change when the 20th century is underway. I would say definitely after Theodore Roosevelt's presidency, his presidency and Woodrow Wilson's push forward certain shared items and are opposed in other ways. But it's around the period of maybe, Wilson's administration, maybe TR's. And also we have to remember there's two elements to this. There's a historical association called the Association of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. They couldn't pick one. So the question of reform and the rise of popular democracy and the decline of machine politics and of at least an attack on the corruption of the late 19th century are part of the story as well. So I would guess, it's so hard to pick out, but if we're going to incorporate all these things, it's around 1880 to 19 teens, maybe 1920. And that's because I'm trying to rope in as many of these developments as possible that I think are all reflected in the way that popular democracy is working and the way the federal government is working.
When I think of the Gilded Age, the word that we're using, and now listening to you, maybe we're wrong, but we use the term the age of transformation. And our last speakers have talked about the incredible innovation that occurred in this country, from cars to planes to skyscrapers to you name it. Things were happening quickly. The telephone, can you imagine what it must have been like to be a farmer in Kansas and go to the Chicago World's Fair and see electricity for the first time? An entire city lit up. It really was an exciting time from an innovation perspective. But then on the political front, can you talk a little bit about the presidents during that period, TJ? Because I think that we are very confused about what seems to be a lack of leadership at the federal or national level. And maybe I'm right, maybe I'm wrong, but I think I'm right. And why was that?
Yeah,
people don't say, boy, that Chester Arthur, or, wow, Benjamin Harrison, he's a guy we'll never forget, or wow, Grover Cleveland, really important president. We don't think in terms, but we know who Abraham Lincoln is. So what's going on politically in this period?
Yeah, it's very interesting because there was a lot more going on politically than people realize, but it was a real period of transformation. And that's a very good word for the era also. The question of politics is an art executed in the medium of power. And there's two aspects to power. One is getting it, accumulating it, and maintaining it. The other side is using it. And if you look at the presidents between Ulysses S. Grant and McKinley to a certain extent, but Theodore Roosevelt definitely, they are operating in an era Grant used power very effectively for a time. He had plenty of faults, but he was really fighting the battles of Reconstruction and was really engaging federal enforcement to actually extend real citizenship and to protect the demands for real citizenship from African Americans, especially in the South. But after he's out, Reconstruction from the federal enforcement side is over. And then it really becomes a question of the age of the machine. Now, we've had machine politics, since, early in the Republic. It's what it goes back to the age of the founding, the founders, actually. But the real triumph of machine politics is in the 1870s and 80s, especially 1890s. And what they do is it's all about serving constituents and about organizing constituencies to win elections and to maintain a grip on power. It's like the old saying in Chicago, it's not when you show up at a government office, it's not who you are, it's who sent you. And having connections to the politically influential kingpins is what got you a job, and giving people jobs is what maintained power. And so the presidents reflected that they were spending a lot of their time serving constituencies. There's one historian who notes that Richard Franklin Bensel, that the Republican Party was trying to maintain its grip on power with a three-pillared system. So they were actually literally transferring wealth from Democratic hands to Republican hands. So they had a high tariff. So that's hurting the agricultural South, but it is shifting income and resources to the industrial North. It was engaged in pensions for Union veterans and then their heirs. And that was a major shift of resources again to Union veterans, which means to the North. And also the gold standard, which today just seems like a cue for all the students in class to fall asleep. And at the time was this gigantic issue for people. It was like one of the few ways in which the government intervened in the economy. What is our money? And when there's not enough money, it really hurts the economy, and it hurts the people at the bottom of the totem pole. And so a little inflation is good for most people. Too much, we all know how unpleasant that is. But also if you get deflation, where prices are actually going down, that actually is terrible. Imagine borrowing $100 and then you have to pay back the equivalent of $200, the next week. I mean, it's terrible for farmers. So but that's not using power very much. It's a matter of just sort of setting up a structure to reward your followers. And two things help change that. One is the people I'm not really talking about, but are very, very important, William Jennings Bryan and the populist movement. Mm-hmm. And William Jennings Bryan's famous Cross of Gold speech in 1896, he didn't just talk about the gold standard and trying to get rid of it. He said things like, you can't just count on things to get better for people by helping those at the top and expecting it. He didn't say this, but expecting it to trickle down. He said, no, you make things better by helping people at the bottom. And this is our modern political debate. How do you use power to help American people in general? And that actually influenced someone who's a big critic of his and fought his election in 1896, Theodore Roosevelt. And Roosevelt really saw that approach as anarchy and socialism. And yet that idea actually helped to motivate his policies when he became president. And he had started to move, he had started by battling the machine politics, the trying to keep control of government in party organization hands.
And he was doing that when as governor or?
Oh, no, actually, this is what his entire career was built on.
Okay.
Up to the presidency. And it was only when he really got to the pinnacle of power that he really began to focus not on how democracy worked, but what do you do with it? And again, following on the lead of Bryan and others, but with a Republican, bent, of course. But he started off, his father had been a reformer. And when he went into politics right out of college, got elected and started to serve in 1882 in the New York State legislature, and reform was his big issue. He thought he was battling at least Jay Gould in what he thought was a corrupt deal with a judge. He fought and got a modest civil service reform bill through. And this became his big focus. His primary focus was civil service reform, which basically means getting rid of the spoil system, hiring people because of who they know, and, letting the bosses, pick who goes into government, changing everyone in government every 2 to 4 years when there's an election. There was a big movement whose importance is hard to understand now, where they wanted to hire people based on merit and not on politics, so that you get professionals who aren't just pushing a political agenda. You don't just get hacks. And so he went from the legislature, and then he left the legislature. He started writing. He was very involved in his ranching in the West. That all went south. And then he got back into politics, and he ended up serving as a U.S. Civil Service Commissioner. And, this came in under Arthur. Arthur was a creature of machine politics, President Arthur. And yet, and he was put on the ballot with Garfield to please all of the machine politicians in New York and elsewhere. And so Garfield gets shot by a guy who was insane, but he was seeking a job. And that really brought to the fore all the civil service demands, reformers' demands. And so he felt he had no alternative but to sign the Pendleton Act, which said, we're going to start hiring people based on merit, testing and things like that. And they are protected from political firing. Now, the thing is, though, is that all the machine presidents, you could call them, Harrison, Cleveland, they actually expanded the merit-based hiring, and you would think, why? Aren't they, in with the machines and, maintaining power for Republicans or Democrats? But the thing is that machine politics really shrank the power of presidents, because members of Congress got control over appointments in their districts, and presidents actually lost control of their power as presidents. And so they wanted it back. And so expanding the merit-based hiring, helped to restore presidential power. So even though they're these people who didn't seem to do much, the Congress seemed to lead the way. That's true, but they helped lay the groundwork in small but important ways for a government that could actually do things, that had professionals in office and not a bunch of political hacks. And even though people weren't, the federal government wasn't too aggressive yet in the use of its power, there are important changes going on that set the stage for Theodore Roosevelt as president. And he was right in the middle of it as Civil Service Commissioner. He was out there with very little power, but a lot of publicity making opportunities. He was out there bringing out cases where political hacks were, being appointed to office. There was one guy who had a position in a customs house, and his job was to basically do all the math. And the guy was illiterate and couldn't tell the difference between a plus sign and a minus sign because he was hired politically. And so that, experience pitted him directly against machine politicians, Republicans and Democrats. And also it gave him 6 years of experience with how the federal government actually works on the ground. And this is a really overlooked aspect of his preparation for the presidency. He probably knew how the federal government actually interacted with American society better than any president before him, because he had all these years, not only in lower levels of government, but being out there inspecting reservations, inspecting custom houses and post offices, conducting hearings, interviewing people. And he got a lot of heat for it. But he was widely respected, and these hearings got him a lot of attention. So he was already early in his career a national celebrity.
When I think of the 1880s and 1890s, and maybe I'm wrong, but I think of the political leaders as being the industrial leaders of this country, the power that they had. So correct me if I'm wrong, but the power that the Fricks had and the Carnegies had, it was pretty unbelievable. So yes, you had the boss Tweeds and the real on the ground people, but the power of the corporate world was pretty significant. Is that correct to believe?
Yeah, I think so. And, this is something that I really learned from my work on Cornelius Vanderbilt, is that, there was a complicated relationship between corporations and machine politics. And it wasn't all, it changed over time. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, he really pioneered, he wasn't the only one, but he was one of the pioneers of the truly giant corporation. And one of the problems they faced in the early years, the 1870s of real and 60s and 70s of giant corporations, is that they were very rich, and so they were made targets by corrupt politicians.
And there were no controls at all governing them, correct?
Oh yeah, there was basically no regulation.
Yeah, right.
And that was something that Vanderbilt really exploited, even though he was in a different category from some of the more explicitly corrupt politicians who were out bribing legislatures and things like that, like Jay Gould, who's also a very good businessman. But and so Vanderbilt, he would take advantage of that. So, for example, famously in 1867, in a dispute with the owners of the New York Central Railroad, which connected to his railroads in New York State, he stopped receiving their trains, and it basically cut off New York City from contact with the rest of the country west of the Hudson. And it was during a blizzard, so you can even get, ferries to Manhattan. And it was such a disaster that the people in the New York Central couldn't meet their margin calls. They had to sell out, and Vanderbilt ended up taking over that company. But cutting off the nation's largest city from contact with the rest of the country was quite an exploitation of private power.
Takes a lot of guts too.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
The man had some courage.
Yeah, he definitely did. And he calculated everything very well, and it worked out for him. But it started a conversation in New York, and there certainly were conversations elsewhere about what government should do to limit corporate power and regulate it. And these really high profile, high stakes battles laid that out. Now, at the same time, there were people called strikers who were lobbyists who would then go in and threaten a corporation to get the legislature to pass a bill that would undercut its business or its stock value. And so corporations would pay them off. And so they are actually being extorted, and then they would step in and exploit, and then they would have to go to them and pay up. Otherwise, they'd be ripped off by corrupt legislators.
And when these regulations began to come into effect, were the Goulds and the Fricks and the Carnegies and the Vanderbilts, were they fighting back? And if they were, how did you fight in those days against ever increasing regulation? Is it that you go to your congressperson, or you would go behind the scenes and talk to somebody? Because if you talk to the president, you're probably not going to have a lot of influence. How did they? Yeah, I guess the question is, how did they fight?
Well, it's an interesting question because, there were a couple of things that shifted at the same time. So one of the big, there were statewide regulations. A lot of the things that people were worried about was, long distance transportation. People thought naturally the cost of transportation should be based on the distance. But the big railroads were competing not for all traffic, they were competing for what they called through traffic from the major hubs where they all had stations like Chicago, and like the East Coast major hubs like New York or Philadelphia and Baltimore. And so in competing for these long distance traffic, they would cut the costs for the long distance shippers, because that's what they were competing for. They weren't all competing for all the local stops on their lines. They had a monopoly on their own lines because nobody was building to compete everywhere. So, if you lived in, a small city or small town in Indiana, there might be probably only one railroad coming through town. And so you had to pay the local freight, costs. And so farmers, shippers, especially, small local merchants, they were really upset about this. So you started to see the passage of state laws that said everybody who comes into our state has to charge the same rate per mile for all traffic. And, today we're used to, throat cutting competition and airlines and whatnot. And we're used to prices shifting all the time. But, this seemed like an offense against nature. It seemed like human beings coming in and corruptly, distorting nature and imposing their own will on it. And people hated it. So even though now it seems like an obscure deal, to them, it was like, they're saying, no, the sun is going to come up at midnight. I mean, it was really upsetting. And so the Supreme Court stepped in and said, no, you can't do that because that's interfering with interstate commerce, which is actually probably true constitutionally. But then a couple of things happened. One is the Interstate Commerce Commission was created to try to regulate railroads. Railroads actually kind of liked that. And some railroad people actually pushed for it because railroading was so cutthroat and that a lot of railroads would go into receivership, to go bankrupt, and then they were still competing for business, even though they weren't making any money, they were bankrupt. And so they would cut their costs down to maintain traffic because it's better to lose $1 than $10. And so the businesses that were making money had to cut their rate. It was just constantly cutthroat competition. So having a central agency to actually regulate it and say you're all playing by the same rules was a relief to them. So so sometimes the the regulation didn't end up working the way you thought. The other thing is that the way that money in politics work changed, because the Pendleton Act not only said we're going to start hiring people based on their merit, but it also said you can no longer go to federal employees and say you've all got to kick back money to the machine, which is the way that party treasuries worked. That they would get a kickback from the people they got into office. And so, you serve your constituents, get them in jobs, but then they've got to kick back part of their salary. Well, when that was made illegal, the parties had to, and they already were, it's not like this is the only cause, but, they went where the money was, which was big corporations. And, there was something that when Benjamin Harrison was elected, and he gave a big speech, thanking Providence for this wonderful victory. And his hard-bitten campaign manager said he didn't realize how many men got to the penitentiary and trying to get him into the White House. So it was a real age of big money politics started. And ironically, some of the impulse for that came from the reform movement and their accomplishments. Finally, you had Roscoe Conkling. And Roscoe Conkling had been the head of the New York stalwart machine. And so when he, in a tussle with Garfield, lost, and it was a big defeat in the age of machine politics.
What year would have this been, TJ?
So this is when Garfield was alive, so it was 1881.
Okay.
And so he became a corporate lawyer, and he'd helped to write the 14th Amendment, which guarantees, individual rights, and it was meant to really cement human rights, the civil rights laws that were being passed by Congress after the Civil War. And he argued before the Supreme Court that it was written with corporations in mind. And so right to due process, the rights of citizenship basically were meant to be extended to corporations as well, which was a huge revolution in the way people saw saw corporations, excuse me. And so, it wasn't everything. You could say it's overblown, but that was a part of it as well. The Supreme Court began to, issue decisions in the 1880s that really protected corporations, to a large extent from these new regulations that were being passed, both at the state and the federal level. And so, there was this tussle that was working out in the 1880s, 1890s, where attempts at regulation of corporations was being set back. And it was a combination of issues. The Supreme Court justices who were appointed, the Conkling especially as a corporate attorney, so a lot of these ways are the ways in which they were working out contributions to campaigns, et cetera. And then also, you had the machines who wanted to protect their sources of income. Now, the guy who Conkling was succeeded by as one of the Republican machine chieftains was Thomas C. Platt. And Platt was a guy who fought for years to get control of the Republican Party because he had enemies, et cetera. Finally, in 1894, he took control of the Republican Party in the state of New York, and everybody just really firmly, and he kept it for until his death in the 20th century. And people began to call him boss. And this is a guy he himself was head of an express company. He lived in New York City. He had a suite at the Fifth Avenue Hotel. This is a guy who was very tight with business and with corporate leaders and was one himself. And, he said he believed that, someone had a right to, earn money. Businesses had a right to earn money, and politicians should protect that. And, but he was vindictive as a snake and just utterly ruthless. He never had a grudge that he could forget. And so when in 1894, he's finally the recognized overall boss of New York State Republicans, he was very proud of this. Also that year, a reform Republican mayor was elected in New York City. And somebody said, are you going to go see the mayor? And he goes, oh, well, if the mayor wants to see me, he can come see me anytime he likes. He said, I may be a boss, but I'm an easy one. And everybody thought this was hilarious because he was anything but an easy boss. He was, one newspaper wrote, well, he says he's an easy boss. He's certainly a boss easily. And he was a tough character. And unfortunately, historians didn't dig into that story, and they talked about how he's a very gentlemanly man and whatnot. It was the opposite. So Theodore Roosevelt that year, 1895, was named head of the police commission in New York by Governor Strong, who was a reformist politician, mayor, excuse me. And one of the big goals that Theodore Roosevelt had in the police commission was not so much policing. And he wanted honest, nonpartisan police, but he also knew that he was not a police professional. In fact, one of the other board members was a former assistant district prosecutor. And so he actually knew how the department worked and relied on the people who actually knew the department better for the nuts and bolts. But he really wanted to prevent the police department from being used as a political tool. And so now, having fought the reform effort at the federal level, now he's at the city level, largest city in the country, but at the city level. And again, he knew how to use publicity to promote his cause. So he held all these high-profile hearings as civil service commissioner. Now he began to do things like go out at 2 a.m. with a couple of his friends who were journalists at his side and go and walk the rounds where police were supposed to be. And he would find policemen sleeping in a hay cart or, hanging out at a bar. And, he would catch them basically, not doing their jobs. And so this, of course, was wonderful. Here's the head of the police commission actually walking the streets at 3 a.m. And it got a lot of attention and it made him very famous once again. But his main concern was the ways in which the police were a tool of Tammany Hall. and how they had actually coerced people. They would actually arrest Republican voters on election day. And one of the big ways in which Tammany Hall used the police was to extort saloon owners into pushing their customers into the voting the Democratic ticket. And saloon owners, it was the local meeting place, it was the social hall. And local saloon owners were often the local political leaders because they ran, the community center.
Yeah.
And so there was a New York state law which said all of the saloons are supposed to be closed on Sundays. And Tammany would say, the police will close down anyone who's not playing ball. And anyone who is an influential politician for Tammany or who agrees to go along with us, they can stay open on Sundays. And so it had always been used as a political weapon. And so TR says, no, we're going to close everybody on Sunday. It's what the law says, and also it'll take away this weapon, this lever from Tammany Hall. Well, people were incredibly upset about it, and it made him look like he was a prohibitionist. Well, that's not really, he didn't like the liquor industry. Most progressives at the time didn't, including Lincoln, including Frederick Douglass. They really disliked the liquor industry. But it really was targeting this machine weapon. Well, the problem is that it turned off a lot of people, including German immigrants, who voted for Republicans. So Thomas C. Platt was very upset by this. And this battle began. It started as a struggle against the Democratic machine, and now it became a struggle against the Republican machine. And it's a very interesting story because it's very detailed. But what happens is, in order to limit the power of Roosevelt and of the reformers, and to be able to preserve, all this patronage, the ability to hand out jobs in New York, which was basically a Democratic town, Thomas E. Platt, the Republican boss, pushes this plan that had been in the works and kind of stalled to expand New York from Manhattan into 5 boroughs, creating New York City we know today. And it was a huge accomplishment, but one of the reasons was to take power away from the reformers in the Republican Party and away from Theodore Roosevelt, and to guarantee the machines slices of the patronage jobs that they could hand out to reward reformers. And so there's this kind of, I wouldn't say untold because other people have covered it, but it's this whole struggle that helped
Right.
the New York we know today. And it was
Back and forth. Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry, I've gone on too long.
No. The struggle, I can just envision it with your words. One of the questions that I wanted to ask you was, during this period of time, there were a lot of social movements emerging. The whole labor movement came into being. Women began to pay more attention to rights for themselves. Certainly, African Americans are standing up. Did that have an impact too? And I'm thinking of the real reformer in that whole period was Teddy Roosevelt. And and I may be wrong about this, TJ, but all of the others in the 70s, 80s, 90s, they were presidents, but all of a sudden comes this reformer. Was it because all of these other movements were emerging and you almost had to kind of be ready to look at the world in a different way politically?
It's a very interesting story. I mean, one of the interesting things is the way in which people responded to different constituencies that were demanding recognition. It's kind of all over the map. I mean, they ignored anyone they could. Let's put it that way. So, for example, when Harrison was president, lynching was on the rise, and it was already rampant. And so, in the Harrison papers, there are letters from especially there's a big petition from the Black Baptist Ministers Association, and they presented a long list that had been published in a Black newspaper of all the people who had been killed in the last year, lynched in Virginia alone. And it's just shocking. And they sent this demand that the president do something about it. There was legislation on the books that could have been used. Of course, we all know there wasn't an anti-lynching act. And it took a week before Harrison wrote back, and it was this kind of, petty, oh, don't pick on me, I can't really do anything, you're really annoying me with this. I mean, it was really, by that time, and, we're talking now the, end of the 1880s, early 1890s, there were still Republicans who were being elected to Congress, not many, it's shrinking because of violence and oppression. There is still a lot of political activism in the South, which is again where most Black Americans were. There's still presidential appointments of important Black leaders, but more and more they're being marginalized, and they're politically, and they're fighting back, but Harrison treats them like, I can ignore you. Then Cleveland comes along and he brings in all these Southern former Confederates, and he appoints them because they're important Democrats. And so they're holding federal office. Theodore Roosevelt was very upset. He was still civil service commissioner under Roosevelt, and he wrote a bitter, under Cleveland, and he wrote a bitter report about how all of these women were graduates of the new Black colleges and universities. And they're highly qualified. They're working in federal offices, in this case, the printer's office, and there's no complaints against them. They're doing well. They do well in the tests, and they were just sacked wholesale, quite against the law, by a Southerner who'd been appointed by Cleveland. And so, Roosevelt was not a civil rights activist, but he was outraged by this, and he had no powers, could do nothing about it. So you see across two different parties, two different administrations, how that's fading. And yet at the same time, women are becoming more active. The women's suffrage movements are becoming more vocal. And, you have letters back and forth, friendly letters between, of all people, Boss Platt and, the leaders of the women's suffrage movement. He talks about how he sympathizes with them, et cetera.
This is an amazing story, and I wish we had started with all of this, because I love hearing the emergence of all of these, soon to be big time fighters. TJ, I can't believe that this time has gone so quickly. I just got the note that we have about 30 seconds left, and I'm sorry to interrupt you and have to tell you that it's over, but we can't wait for you to come to Newport. TJ will be here on May 18th. He will be lecturing in the Great Hall of the Breakers. His topic is Age of the Machine, the fight to reinvent democracy in the Gilded Age. And you can certainly see we are blessed to have you as one of our keynote speakers, because this is a man who really knows politics during this period of time. Thank you so very much for being with us. This is great.